Graduate student at the University of Kentucky, and on behalf of the university, I want to welcome you to the UK main stage. The Kentucky Book Festival is proud to bring to the UK main stage the 2024 Pulitzer Prize winner for biography for our next conversation. In his landmark biography, best-selling author and journalist Jonathan Eig gives us a portrait of the Martin Luther King Jr. for our time, a deep thinker, a brilliant strategist, and a committed radical who led one of history's greatest movements and whose demand for racial and economic justice remains as urgent today as it was in their lifetime. In addition to King, A Life, Mr. Eig has penned award-winning biographies from Muhammad Ali and Lou Gehrig. Please welcome to the stage Jonathan Eig. Joining Mr. Eig this afternoon is the president and CEO of the Muhammad Ali Center, a nonprofit museum and cultural center in Louisville, Kentucky. Please give a warm welcome to DeVone Holt.
Well, thank you all for being here. This is an incredible book fair with so many great authors and so many great book lovers that it's always exciting for me to be here, especially as someone years ago who wrote my first book and really had it launched in this space. So I can appreciate what this means. I didn't sell as many books as this guy is selling, but this was a great place to start. Jonathan, how you doing?
Doing great, thank you.
Thank you for being here in Louisville, Kentucky, and you've gotten yourself off to an incredible start with this most recent book of yours, but this is obviously not your first. But from our original conversation downstairs, you did say that to date this is your best performing book. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Nobody beats Muhammad Ali, I know, but the Ali book I'm so proud of it. The King book is doing great too. I don't want to put them in the ring together though.
Well, so I'm glad it's off to a great start. I want to start by asking you, as someone who since 2002 has become an sort of an ardent King fan, studying King and the Civil Rights Movement. For years, I've been enamored by King and what the others were able to accomplish in that period of our society. And in my studies, I've come across a million King books. And so for me, the first and probably most important question to ask is, why did you, in light of all of the other King books that have been written, feel the need to write another book about Martin Luther King Jr.?
No, that's a great question. And I just met Martin Luther King's granddaughter downstairs.
Oh, wow.
And Martin Luther King's daughter-in-law.
Oh, wow.
And Dr. King's daughter-in-law asked me that same question. What made you decide to write a book about my father-in-law? And the answer is really simple. I was working on my Muhammad Ali book, and I was meeting all of these people who knew Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali. And I began asking some of them, how did they get along? What was it like when Martin Luther King met Muhammad Ali? Because I wanted to fill in that page of my Muhammad Ali book. But the more I began talking to them, the more I realized what a gift it is that there are still hundreds of people alive who knew Martin Luther King really well, and that they're not going to be around forever. I need to go out and meet them. I just wanted to meet people who met Martin Luther King. And once I thought about that, my initial instinct was then immediately to check when was the last King biography written.
Okay.
And it was 1982. That's crazy. Like, we need a new King biography for every generation.
82?
That was the Stephen Oates book,
Okay.
Let the Trumpet Sound. And there have been, as you said, hundreds of books written about King, but not the true biography, not cradle to grave. This is what makes the man tick. And I felt like these people knew King as a human being. And one of the problems that we have today in America is that we've lost sight of King as a human being.
Yeah.
We turn these people, and Muhammad Ali too, we turn them into heroes, and we write movies and plays, and we build statues, and we name airports, and we build monuments, and we forget that they were flesh and blood. We forget that they had problems. People don't know that Dr. King suffered from depression, that he attempted suicide twice as a teenager. They don't know that he was deeply depressed and that Americans really turned on him in the last few years of his life, and that it hurt his feelings, that he had feelings. And also that we forget how religious he was. We forget how radical he was. I wanted to write a book that just helped people connect with the person again, because we've got the monument, we've got the national holiday, and those aren't going anywhere, but we need to keep the person in our minds.
Well, you've delved deep for this book. I, again, as someone who's read and studied King for years, just could really appreciate the depths that you were able to go to paint what feels like a well-rounded, robust image and picture of him. But you said something in the book that that I found very interesting. I'll share this with you, and I ask you to expound on it. You said, in hallowing King, we have hallowed him. I'll say that again for those who couldn't hear. In hallowing King, we have hallowed him. We've defanged him, replacing his complicated politics and philosophies with catchphrases. Tell us more about what you meant with that, because I'm assuming through all of this research that you've done, which we'll talk about, that you've got a better understanding of the King that probably most of us today don't.
Yeah, in hallowing King, in celebrating him, in making a national holiday, and building naming 1,000 streets and 100 public schools after him, we honor him in a way he deserves to be honored, but we also hollow out his message. So the hallowing leads to this hollowing, and by that I mean we are embracing the parts of his story that are easy for us to accept. I have a dream. Dr. King had a dream. We all learned to live in harmony. The dream came true, and we don't have to protest anything anymore. That's the message that some of us take away from I Have a Dream. I have had these fierce debates with people who say, well, Dr. King was opposed to affirmative action because he said that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And I said, no. You are trying to use his words to water down his message, to weaken him. And Harry Belafonte said to me, we only like dead radicals in this country. And it's true. Dr. King was a radical. We can handle it. And we need to embrace that radical spirit again.
So in all that you've learned and understood and researched through this process, what did you learn about King that you didn't know before you started this process?
About 600 pages worth. I realized how little I knew. And like I said, first of all, just realizing what the man was like. You know, it was so important for me to humanize him in a way that, you know, Harry Belafonte and Dick Gregory knew. He chewed his fingernails. He shouted at the TV. He liked to smoke cigarettes and had to hide the cigarettes from his kids because they'd flush them down the toilet, right?
He was notoriously late.
He was notoriously late for meetings. He overate. He needed diet pills at times. And he needed sleeping pills, too, because he was so anxious and worried. He was in the hospital being treated for depression when he got the news that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. How crazy is that? And he thought he was dreaming because he'd taken all of these sleeping pills because he couldn't get to sleep. So like I said, I wanted to humanize him, but the other big thing that I learned that really shocked me, and I think we all know that Dr. King was surveilled by the FBI, that they were tapping his phones, that they were putting listening devices in his hotel rooms, and we now have the transcripts of his phone conversations as a result of that. But what I failed to fully appreciate was just how extensive the government's campaign against King really was. That we have a tendency to blame it all on J. Edgar Hoover, who was a racist, who deserves a lot of blame, but it's not fair to let the others off the hook, because it's worth remembering that Robert F. Kennedy is the person who authorized those wiretaps. John F. Kennedy approved it, LBJ encouraged it, and President Johnson, while working with Dr. King to deliver perhaps the most important legislation in American history, was stabbing King in the back at the same time by encouraging the FBI to release the tapes of King's hotel rooms to members of the media. So this is what I talk about when I say we need to embrace the complexity of King's story and not settle for the easy stuff.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that, but before I do, you know, you mentioned that there's still people alive who knew King, but there are a lot that have since passed on. Talk to us about the research that you went through to write this book. How much of it was working your way through FBI files and interviews, and then how much of it was direct interaction with people? It sounds like you talked to Harry Belafonte. What kind of other interactions were you able to have to build out the book that ultimately became?
Yeah, so hundreds of interviews. I was lucky to start before COVID, so I was able to do a lot of them face-to-face. And then during COVID, I was actually kind of lucky because a lot of these people are old and they couldn't go out of the house, so I could call them every day. And they really, they would have been too busy for me otherwise, but suddenly, they're just happy to have someone to talk to, and I'm happy to interview them every day sometimes. But in addition to the interviews, I was really surprised at how much new archival material I was able to find.
Yeah.
And you would think someone like Dr. King, there's a whole college department dedicated to his study at Stanford, and Atlanta has several places where study of King, and there are college professors. So you'd think that everything had been discovered already, and I think that's a good lesson for future historians. Like, we always need to go digging again, because you always find new things. So I found an entire book, an autobiography that Martin Luther King's father wrote but never published.
Wow.
And nobody knew it existed. His family didn't know it existed.
Really? Where did you find it?
It was in the archives at the King Center, but they didn't know they had it.
Wow.
There were only 2 copies in the world. They didn't know it even existed. I found tapes that Coretta Scott King made, and I should mention that one of my really important goals with this book was to write a portrait of Coretta Scott King that shows her in the heroism and the complexity that she deserves.
You painted her as a hero.
She has not yet had a proper biography, and I wanted this book to be as close as I could to that proper biography. But I found tapes that she made right after her husband's death, when she began thinking about writing a memoir. She recorded hours of conversations with a writer that was going to help her with her memoir, and nobody had heard those tapes. I was the first person since that ghostwriter to hit the play button on those tapes. So over and over again, I found new materials. In addition to the FBI releasing more documents, Dr. King had a private archivist, Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who traveled with him everywhere and took notes on every meeting. And the boxes of his papers had never been opened at the Schomburg Center in Harlem.
Wow.
So it's a great reminder to writers that there's always something new to be learned, even from a subject that you think has been well covered.
Right. So, just curious, how long did it take you to write the book?
About 6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. A lot of incredible research went into that. Again, as somebody who was a King fan, I've become very familiar, I think like many of us have, with some of his signature speeches and some of his signature work. You know, the letter from the Birmingham jail, obviously the I Have a Dream speech, the speech he gave in Memphis the night before he died. I think a lot of us have become familiar with those words, that language, the rhythm in which he talked. But I will tell you, having known and experienced all of that, I was still especially moved in the way that you wrote about the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. Now, I won't admit this too often, so this might be the only place you guys hear me make this confession. But I literally cried reading this book as you were painting the picture of him delivering the I Have a Dream speech. It was as if I could still feel his anointing. And do feel like personally he was anointed to do the work that he ultimately did. Did you feel that in the research and as you were working to write this book?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, because imagine that you're me and you're setting out to write this book. One of the first things you start thinking about is, how am I going to write the I Have a Dream chapter?
Yeah.
Because it's his most famous moment, it's his most powerful speech. And I'm just a little guy with a bunch of little black dots that I have to work with to try to recreate the magic of 200,000 people on the lawn, the sound of King's voice.
Yeah. I
I don't have any audio to work with. I don't have any video to work with. How am I going to do it? How am I going to make people feel the power of that speech? I'm handicapped, right? Also, I'm only allowed to use 130 words of that speech.
I was wondering why you cut certain things out. I just couldn't figure out.
Because the King family controls the copyright, and Ms. King is not here. So I can tell you, are you here, Ms. King? She's not here. The family would not give me permission to use the entire speech.
Okay. Okay.
I offered to pay for it. They said no. So I'm handcuffed in so many ways. So then I started thinking, what do you do? What do I have at my advantage? What can I do to compensate for what I don't have to work with? And I began to think about the fact that I have interviews. I've interviewed dozens of people who were there that day. I can try, and I've been so moved by their descriptions of how it felt to be in that crowd that day and how it changed their lives and how it gave them hope for this country, that we can move past our racism, we can move past our intolerance, we can be better people. Can I take you into that crowd and help you feel what they felt that day? Maybe I can do that. So I decided to try to write the book in kind of this panoramic effect.
Yeah.
There's King. There's Francine Yeager, this 18-year-old girl from Chicago who gets on the train at the last minute with nothing but a Pepsi and a change of underwear in her backpack. There's Gordon Gunny Gundrum, the white park ranger who's standing next to King. He's the last line of security in case someone tries to hurt him. I'm going to put you in their minds, in their heads, and help you feel what King's words mean to them in the moment. And I tried to write it as if you were there with them. And I'm glad to hear that you think it worked, because it was the biggest writing challenge of my life, I think.
It was phenomenal. I truly felt it. And I don't know if any of you guys have, but in that particular portion of the book, if you have not read it and you plan to, I do suspect you will be moved as well. It's a phenomenal writing job. It was indeed. You know, going through the book, there was so much that, that even though I knew it and I understood it, it was interesting to see how you put in context the real struggle. You know, I think we've seen video footage of protest and water hoses and dogs attacking civil rights protesters. And those were, as they intended them to be, the very visible, sort of orchestrated attempts to raise the profile of the suffering that was happening. But there was a lot of failures and struggles in between the ones that got the headlines. Just talk to us a little bit about sort of what you experienced in uncovering more of those failures in this process for King and the others who were involved in this civil rights march, because so much of it we seem to in today's times. And my son, who's 15 years old, and we were talking about King and the way that he's learning of King in school. It's victory to victory to victory, but there were a lot of failures in between the bus protest, the March on Washington, and the legislation that was eventually passed.
Yeah, that's so important to remember, and I'm glad you and your son are talking about it, because you know, we write the history books and we focus on these, as you said, March on Washington, you know, Birmingham, Selma, these big successes. And we forget that King struggled. It was a civil rights struggle because they struggled, and King knew that his job was to shine a light on American racism so that it became unavoidable that we do something about it.
Right.
But in order to do that, you had to fail over and over again. And remember, when he leads the Montgomery bus boycott, he's 26 years old.
Incredible. Yeah.
And everybody says, okay, now do it again. Do it everywhere. We need this all over the country. And he's 26, and he's literally writing to his old college professors, like, help me. They're expecting me to pull rabbits out of my hat, and I don't know what to do. And he tries to duplicate the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, and it fails over and over and over again. Name his next big success after the Montgomery bus boycott. You could argue that it's not really until Birmingham that he has a huge triumph. And that's 8 years later. 8 years of struggle, 8 years of where others seem to be taking over the movement, right? You've got the freedom rides, you've got the lunch counter. Where's King? He's watching, he's helping, he's learning, but he's failing over and over again in that time. and he never gives up. And that's what makes him such a hero to me, is that as he's failing, he's continuing to believe that he must continue to work. And then when he finally has some success and breaks through in 63 and 64, he decides he's got to go further, and he begins attacking northern racism and northern segregation and the Vietnam War. And everybody says, whoa, stay in your lane, shut up and dribble, you know? And he refuses to do that. And that's when his popularity starts to fall. So more failure, more discouragement. And you can hear him on these tapes, the FBI tapes, saying, I feel like no one's listening to me anymore. So the struggle is a personal struggle as well.
Yeah, and so you paint this picture that allows us to experience King again as a whole man, not just the one who stands on stage, not just the one who gives speeches, not just the one who leads marches, but a man who wrestles with depression, a man who has his own indiscretions, a man that is, in some cases, maybe even unorganized as a leader. Talk to me about sort of this rounding out and understanding of King from a holistic perspective that has not necessarily made it into the way that we have come to understand King.
This is one of the great challenges of biography, and I felt the same challenge with Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to be honest with my readers. I don't think my readers are going to trust me when I talk about these figures' greatness if I don't also talk about their flaws. And I also think it's important to remind people that we don't have to be perfect to try to be great. We don't have to be perfect to attempt to lead. We don't have to be perfect to attempt to change the world, because if we expect perfection, no one's going to step forward and try to lead. So I knew that it was going to be hard for Lonnie Ali to read a book that included Muhammad Ali's marital indiscretions. I knew that it was going to be hard for the King family to read a book that dealt with the fact that he was a flawed human being who did not have, was not faithful to Coretta. But my job is to the reader and to the truth and to the legacy of these figures, and I think that ultimately they're better served by the truth, even with those things that are hard for us to accept.
Well, so full transparency, right before coming here, I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and my best friend and I started a mentoring program with teenage boys in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we have sessions on Saturday mornings. We met at 10 o'clock. I wrapped up at noon, and I drove straight here. But I was really intentional today about using my time with our young boys, all teenagers, black boys, who I have history with, where we talk about their heroes and my heroes. And today we talked about this book. And that was part of the conversation we had about whether or not a leader, a hero, needed to be perfect in order to still be successful in serving in their respective roles. And they all agreed. But the one thing that they pushed back on, because we've had these conversations, not just with King, but with some other folks over time, is what feels like to them, and if I'm really transparent with you, I've got relationships with the King family. I have obviously relationships with Ali's family, where we're having and hearing these conversations about what feels like an attack on black heroes, exposés, if you will, of their flaws in ways that taint the way that they have been perceived. Have you had those conversations? Have those been presented to you in any ways that you've had to have discussions about and explain what that approach to your work is in getting to that point?
I've had lots of those discussions while I was writing the book with friends and with colleagues and with historians. I had a lot of people reading the book as I was writing and giving me feedback, but also since the book came out. And I really feel like the response has been fantastic among people who've read it. They have embraced that complexity. They have said that they love these people, King and Ali, they love them more after reading about their flaws, because they don't feel like the standards of perfection have to apply, that they feel that they can relate to them better, and their heroism feels like not something out of a Hollywood movie, but something out of real life.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people in particular have approached me and said, I was so moved to hear about King's struggles with mental health, that we've all been there, or we've all had a family member who's been there, and to know that he was suffering the same way and he couldn't talk about it is just heartbreaking, and it helps me to feel like I can talk about it. So overall, I feel like, especially among people who've read the book, I think there's no way that you can read this book, I think, and come away feeling like I'm attacking.
Yeah.
This is a work of love in the Kingian spirit, agape, and I think no matter how you feel about King, I hope that you can sense that on every page.
Well, here's what I will tell you. My personal belief, this is DeVone Holt's take on King. I've believed him to be the greatest citizen that America has ever produced.
I would second that.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you that question, so it's good to hear. and after reading this book, flaws and all, I came away with a greater sense of that than I did before I started reading the book. To your point, it was this to suggest that in spite of all that he wrestled with, and maybe how imperfect he was in certain ways, what he then was able to accomplish to me became even more significant because it wasn't packaged in a simple, easy, rosy pathway. It was even more challenging, and the fact that he was able to accomplish what he did, to me, made him an even greater hero.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when I make the argument that he's the greatest American, period, I point out that all of our great Americans have had flaws. Washington and Jefferson owned slaves, but King accomplished what he did one generation removed. His father was a sharecropper. His grandparents were enslaved. His grandmother was the product of forced sexual activity to generate more property. And 2 generations removed from that, he is leading us toward fulfilling the promise of democracy. He has no money. He has no weapons. He has no political power. He's a private citizen preaching the word of God. And he gets us closer than we've ever been to fulfilling the promise that all men are created equal. And that, to me, makes him the greatest American.
I couldn't concur more. Again, I mentioned to you that I'm a civil rights buff, and I can recall in around 2003, maybe 2004, I was in Atlanta on a business trip. And every time I go to Atlanta, I go to the King Center. It's part of my pilgrimage. But on this particular trip, I got a chance to meet Harry Belafonte, who didn't know me from Adam, never seen me, never known who I was. But I was such a fan of the civil rights movement and understanding his contribution to help keep it alive and to fuel it in many different ways. And I asked if I could talk with him, and he gave me about 90 minutes of his time. And he told me everything I wanted to know and more. It was one of the most cherished experiences that I've had as someone who appreciates what that generation did for my generation. I'm curious to know, in your interviews, what you walked away with in those experiences with Harry Belafonte and others who were part of that generation. Did you come away with any different thinking, even a different feeling about what they experienced then and the significance of what they were able to accomplish?
Yeah, and I felt like it was one of the great blessings of my life to be able to interview these men and women who were heroes of this movement, and to say that I became friends with friends of Martin Luther King. I mean, what a gift. And Belafonte, by the way, was just incredibly beautiful. After my time with him, I said on my way out the door, by the way, you probably hear this a lot, but my mother, who's 80, still has a huge crush on you. And he said, "What's her name?" And I said, "Her name is Phyllis," and he wrote her a note.
Ah, that's awesome.
But anyway, what I came away with most of all was this feeling that these people saw what we were living through today and could put it in some perspective, and were able to say, it's going to be okay, but we have to keep fighting. Like they refused to lose hope. No matter what is going on in the world today, they felt like the world is a better place now than it was 50 years ago because we made it that way. We have to keep fighting, but don't ever lose hope. That's what the message they left me with.
You know, it's interesting you say that because I still have connections to people who were very active during that period. And for black, white, and others who were involved in the civil rights movement during that time, they still hold a great deal of, I'm going to say, energy around the idea of not letting that work fall backwards. And so I'm interested in hearing from your perspective in the conversations that you've had, the research that you've done, to put in context what we are experiencing in America in 2024. We've got an election that's coming up that seems to have exposed a great deal of racism that many people feel, sexism in some cases, nationalism, and a lot of other isms that we find ourselves wrestling with. And many people in my generation, I'm 52, who I hear say they've never seen our world, our nation, so divided. And I can read about a time where we were much more divided, but I'm curious to know what you feel of where we are now in light of what you experienced in writing and researching this book.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we're all wrestling with where we are today in history and where we're going to be, you know, a week from now or you know, a decade from now, and times feel hopeless. But what helps me as somebody who's been living in the 60s and living in history is the feeling that this is a thread that runs through our lives. This story is running through our lives. And what we're experiencing now in this world, the uptick in racism, the push to restrict voting rights, the push to restrict the teaching of black history, it's part of that same thread that's running through Dr. King's life. Because what happens the day after King gives his I Have a Dream speech, when there's this sense of hope in America? What happens the next day? The FBI approves surveillance. And what happens just a week afterwards? After that, the 16th Street Church in Birmingham is bombed, and these innocent little black girls are killed by a member of the Klan who's angry that America might be healing its racial divide. So every time we see progress on race, we see a racist pushback. We see this backlash. And I think what we're living through today is part of the backlash from people who are angry about the election of a black president. And all that means is that we are going to have to fight this over and over again. Dr. King said, the long arc of history bends toward justice. But it doesn't bend by itself. We've got to bend it. And I think that's what where I try to find comfort when it feels like the same problems are happening over again. No, well, yes, they are, but we can still bend that long arc.
Sure. So we'll get to audience questions here in just a minute, so you guys get your questions ready if you have any. This is obviously not your first book. You've written several other books. They've all done well. They've all, with the exception of one, if I'm not mistaken, have been centered around a central figure. King, Ali,
Lou Gehrig
and Jackie Robinson. I'm sorry, forgive me. Are you looking to write more around central figures in your upcoming books, or are there upcoming books that you
I
can
don't
speak
mind
of?
talking about it now because I've decided that I'm going to write my next book about another very controversial figure, George Soros.
Oh wow! Okay, that'll be interesting. That'll be very interesting. Awesome. Well, so we thank you for this book, and I'm now ready to see
folks,
if there are any audience questions here.
First off, let's all give a round of applause for this terrific discussion about the life, legacy, and mythology of Dr. King. Thank you so much. We've got about 10 minutes here where we can do some Q&A, so I'm going to walk around and bring the mic to you. I see your hand, sir. That's exactly what we're going to do. Anyone that has a question, please put your hand up. I'll try to spot you, and we'll get to you as we can. Down front.
Okay, thanks for being here, first of all. You mentioned the copyright issue. Did you seek, and did you get cooperation from the family?
Oh, well, I had cooperation from some members of the family, not from others, and I asked for permission, as I mentioned, to use quotes. You can use fair use, if there are any lawyers in the room, you can use a small percentage of a speech or a poem or a song, but if you use more, you have to pay. So I asked for permission and I offered to pay, but they declined.
Okay, stay on this side, down front.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, could you speak to Dr. King, the intellectual? Of course, you know, he was influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and all that. Could you say a little bit about King as a critical scholar?
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for that question. And it's a great question because one of the reasons that King is so successful, think about this 26-year-old kid shows up and starts speaking in Montgomery and captures the attention of the media, of the world. It's in part because he's a preacher and he's respected. It's in part because he's a protester and he's making trouble. But it's also because he's clearly an intellectual and a theologian with not just credentials, but with ideas. And he's bringing to this movement this philosophy of nonviolence, which Americans have never really seen put into use in American protest before. And that comes from his education. This is a kid who, from a very early age, wants to expand his mind. He wants to be a preacher, but he wants to be an intellectual preacher, more intellectual than his father, who's a country preacher. So he begins educating himself. He enters Morehouse at age 16, goes to seminary to get a degree at, I think he's 19 when he enters Crozier, and then goes on to his doctorate. And all along his father is saying, what do you need all these fancy degrees for to preach? But King he doesn't know what he's preparing for, but he wants to have this more vast understanding of the world. He wants to know the philosophy behind the protest, behind nonviolence. So he's reading Thoreau and studying Niebuhr and Gandhi. And when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, he's got these weapons. And these are weapons that the Southern sheriffs that he's up against do not understand and don't understand how it gives him this power. And that grows from his faith in God and from this backing that his faith is supported by this intellectual understanding. And it's just this incredibly powerful combination. And he's a lifelong learner. He goes on, you know, his whole life. He's traveling with a copy of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited in his briefcase when he's assassinated. This is somebody who understands the importance of education. And in fact, probably if he'd ever felt like he'd succeeded and he could give up the job of being the leading activist in America, he probably would have become a college professor.
Great. Do we have a question? Yeah, a couple on this side. We'll start back here. Can I slide by you really quick?
Hi. As a pastor of a church for 25 years, I've seen the division that King spoke about. I wonder what you think right now, especially because what we're seeing in the Protestant church especially is so much division over all these issues that he pointed out through nonviolent protest. What do you think that he would do? Do you think he would continue nonviolently protesting today?
I feel 100% certain, and I try not to channel King. When people ask me, what would King say, what would King think? I say, here's what he said, and here's what he did, and sometimes I'll say, here's what his friends told me. You know, here's what John Lewis told me. Here's what Harry Belafonte told me. And there's no question that King's commitment to nonviolence was only growing over the course of his life. And by the time he reached the last year of his life, what was he doing? So let's not think about, you know, what he might say. Let's think about what he was doing at the time of his death. He was planning the Poor People's Campaign, which was meant to bring people of all religious denominations, all ethnic minorities, not just minorities, all ethnicities together to expand the civil rights movement to become a human rights movement and to focus on issues like poverty, welfare. He wanted guaranteed jobs, guaranteed income. He wanted us to reimagine capitalism. He wanted us to double down on nonviolence and really begin to think about how we can be more of a global community. So I think the proof is in his actions, and it's sad that that people who agree fundamentally on their religious beliefs are still finding ways to divide themselves.
We had a question down here in the middle.
Hey, John. As a writer myself, I'm always curious. Obviously, your book is really comprehensive, 600 pages of great material. But I'm always curious about stuff that doesn't make the cut for one reason or another. Either you couldn't get enough confirmation that it happened, or it just wasn't sort of sourced in a way that you liked. Were there any stories, and you don't have to tell them, but I'm just really curious, was there anything that you really wanted to get in that you couldn't, or stuff that you cut because it just didn't feel like you couldn't quite get there?
Well, yes, of course, there's a lot that gets left out, and this book could have been, 3,000 pages long, and I would have been very happy to keep going. I found, for example, documents from the Montgomery bus boycott where some scholars from Fisk University went down as soon as the boycott began and began interviewing everyone involved. So bus riders, bus drivers, black people, white people, Klan members, they interviewed. I could have written 1,000 pages just on the Montgomery bus boycott, and there are unbelievable stories of just ordinary people during that time. The other big challenge for me is the last year and a half of his life I crunched down into one chapter. And that was really painful to me. But I wanted my readers to cry at the end of this book. And I knew that I had to move quickly to the end. And I sacrificed a lot. I sacrificed a lot of great speeches and a lot of great sermons that I would have loved for the reader to have heard and to have read. And I had to cut a lot of great characters, people who risked their lives for the civil rights movement, who maybe get a sentence in the book. I interviewed this white priest from Milwaukee who went down to Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery and marched with King and went to jail and ended up becoming a pastor in the South. I interviewed him for days, and I didn't put him in the book. And his story was so good, it could have been a whole chapter. And then I'm sitting at this book event I did last year in Milwaukee, and I'm looking up in the crowd, and I see him. Oh no. And his name is Reverend Joseph Ellwanger. And when we get to the question and answer period, his is the first hand that goes up. I was like, yes, Reverend Ellwanger? And he says, how come I'm not in the book? I said, well, you're in the acknowledgments. I thank you in the acknowledgments. Let's talk later, please. But yeah, I had to. There's a saying in journalism, you have to kill your babies. You have to kill the ones you love to make room for what's important. King was the hero of this story, and a lot of really good people had to be cut.
So we have a couple more minutes. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask our panelists up front?
So culturally, as you've written about a number of African Americans, as a white writer, is there any challenge that you face in interpreting their lives and experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for any biographer, there's a challenge, right? I'm writing Lou Gehrig's story. I'm not a German American. I'm not a baseball player. I don't have ALS, thank God. I have to come in with humility about what I don't know. And that challenge is even greater when you're writing about a woman or a member of another racial group or ethnic group or religious group that is not your own. It means I have to work harder. In this case, I felt like I also needed to ask permission of the people in King world, his friends, his allies, and the people who teach this subject. I went to them first and said, will you help me do this? If I take it on, do we need a new? So I think you have to approach with a lot more humility. I think sometimes there are some advantages to being an outsider. Maybe you work a lot harder. The Bishop of Washington, D.C. said to me, every time you're interviewed, John, when you're asked what's the biggest influence in King's life, you always say Jesus. And I appreciate that. And this is what she said. She said, because coming from a white Jewish journalist, you've got no horse in the race. You're objective, so that's cool. So I think you have to approach with extra humility. You have to work extra hard, and you have to recognize where you have blind spots and try your best. You can't overcome them all. You can't write, there is no perfect book, there is no perfect biography. Any writer taking on any subject is going to have weak spots, and all you can do is do your best and hope the reader feels like you passed the test.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more. Well, we could probably do two more quick questions here, and that'll wrap us up. Yes, sir?
Let me ask you all to switch gears just for a moment and talk a little bit about Ali. And this is for both Mr. Eig and Mr. Holt. As a lifelong Louisvillian, tell me how a young man from the West End of Louisville can rise to become arguably the most famous person in the world.
Yeah, great question. Do we have an hour for that? All right. You know, Dick Gregory said to me, you know, he actually said, white boy, if you're going to write a book about Ali, you better figure out what made a black kid in the Jim Crow South, same age as Emmett Till, think he could call himself the greatest and not get killed for it. And if I had to answer that in 60 seconds, I would say Ali was foolish enough to believe that the world would listen to him. He was courageous enough to think that he knew he was right and he could get away with it. And being able to knock people out helped that cause a little bit too. But he had faith in himself. He had confidence in his words and in his abilities. And I think he had this underpinning of his religious faith that gave him an extra feeling of strength, that like, I know Allah is with me, and I know I'm doing the right thing, and if I have to sacrifice for what I believe, then that's a sacrifice I'll make every time.
You say the same way that King was driven by his Christian faith, Ali was anchored in a Muslim faith that fueled him in many cases.
Yeah, there's something bigger than me, and I don't really matter, so if I have to sacrifice myself, if I have to give up my boxing career, if you want to put me in front of a firing squad, that's fine, but you're still going to have to listen to what I have to say.
Okay, last question, right over here. Yes, sir. I come to you.
Yeah, John Lewis, when he was knocked out on the Patriots Bridge, had Thomas Merton's 7-story mountain in his backpack. Andrew Young was familiar with Thomas Merton. Merton was scheduled to come to the Abbey of Gethsemane for a very quiet retreat, and he had to go to the Memphis strike. He died on the day he was supposed to be at the Abbey of Gethsemane here in Kentucky. I'm not sure any of that has been publicized, but that's the matter of the fact.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we spoke earlier about this. And King was not supposed to be in Memphis. He went because the sanitation workers were on strike, because 2 sanitation workers had been crushed to death in the back of their truck. And he was trying to prepare for the Poor People's Campaign. He was looking forward to going to visit this retreat, to visit with the monks. But he felt like he had to be there to support these sanitation workers, because as he said, these are the people that he's ministering to. These are the people, God's people, whose message the world needed to hear. And he went to Memphis because the first protest march ended in violence, and he was determined to show that the world that he still, the power of nonviolence still had the force to make a difference.
Okay, so once again, folks, let's give a big round of applause for DeVone Holt and Jonathan Eig. Wonderful panel discussion. This concludes this program. We're going to have something else here at 3 p.m. And so if you'd like to stick around for that, stay in your seat. You're more than welcome. Otherwise, there are plenty of other things going on around the festival. Thank you so much for being here and giving us your time.